The Crimean Soccer League is neither Russian nor Ukrainian, leaving its teams and its players marooned in sporting purgatory since Russia annexed the peninsula in 2014. A playoff match last month between Kafka Feodosia and Avangard Yalta. At stake was a spot in the Crimean Premier League, which was formed in 2015. Credit the New York Times Moscow. An odd thing happened in December when soccer fans in Crimea, the disputed Black Sea peninsula annexed by Russia from Ukraine in 2014, began trying to buy tickets to the World Cup. Some ticket seekers trying to make purchases through FIFA, soccer's world governing body, encountered error messages on their computers. The problem, the president of Crimea's Soccer Federation told reporters, was that FIFA still recognized Crimea as part of Ukraine. Fans on the peninsula feared that World Cup tickets had joined cell phones and credit cards on a list of imported items banned by international sanctions. But FIFA said it had imposed no restrictions on ticket purchases anywhere, acknowledging that there may have been some minor technical problems. A solution was found, and fans in Crimea ultimately bought tickets through the Russian Soccer Federation. Still, the confusion illustrated the orphan nature of the sport in Crimea. Like the peninsula itself, the Crimean Professional League is isolated in a geopolitical wilderness. It ended last month, just as the World Cup began to draw a vast international audience to Russia. The professional clubs in Crimea cannot participate in the Russian Premier League. UEFA, soccer's European governing body, forbids it. They can no longer compete in the Ukrainian Premier League, either. European competitions like the Champions League are off limits. Crimea started its own 8-team professional league in 2015, and soccer officials acknowledge that the competition is third-tier, the management and referees are inexperienced and some of the stadiums subpar. In the early days of the league, officials said, some players delivered pizza at night to augment their meager wages. Lacking independence and subject to international sanctions, Crimea remains an outcast among the world's 211 soccer federations. It is not recognized by FIFA. It has formed its own national team, but in name only, as it has yet to play a match. The problem is, at the moment, we can't compete with teams of other countries, Andrei Cherny, a spokesman for the Crimea Soccer Federation, said by telephone through an interpreter. We haven't received any offers of any matches, picked players from Kafka Feodosia before a playoff match. Credit the New York Times. Among World Cup players, the situation in Crimea is acutely understood by Gustaf Svensson, a midfielder for Sweden. He was playing for a club in Simferopol, the Crimean capital, in 2014 and fled with some teammates in the middle of the night when Russia began its land grab. That was one of the scariest times in my life, Svensson, who now plays for the Seattle Sounders in Major League Soccer, said in a telephone interview after first telling his story to the Seattle Times. He was last in Crimea in late February, early March 2014, playing in Simferopol for SC Tavria. The club was formed in 1958 during the Soviet era and became the first champion of the independent Ukraine League in 1992, after the dissolution of the Eastern Bloc. In the winter of 2014, the team's mid-season hiatus was ending. Svensson's girlfriend, Sarah, now his wife, was visiting from Sweden. For the first time, her parents had also come to visit Crimea. Svensson wanted to show them the nearby beaches, the restaurants. Then came chaos. Ukraine's leader, a pro-Kremlin ally, had been ousted and replaced with a pro-Western government. Russian forces without identifying insignia, along with military vehicles, began to appear on the thoroughfares of Crimea, home of Russia's Black Sea Fleet. The airport in Simferopol was closed. At first, the situation remained calm if unnerving, Svensson said. It was pretty weird walking into the city and going to a restaurant and you see snipers on the roofs, he said. It feels like you're walking in a movie or a video game. After SC Tavria played a final exhibition before resuming its, Svensson said he returned to the locker room and found 300 messages and missed calls on his phone. The Russian parliament had given President Vladimir V Putin authority to use military force to respond to the political turmoil in Ukraine. Fearful, Svensson demanded a car or a bus to evacuate himself, his girlfriend and her parents. You don't want to be at the place where World War III might start, he said. A half-dozen teammates wanted to join them, Brazilians, German Ukrainians traveling on dual passports. Team officials provided a bus and a security guard, and carrying their documents, the players left about 9 p.m. for an overnight trip toward what they hoped was safety, not knowing exactly where they were headed. Along the way, they were stopped at a checkpoint where burned in oil drums for warmth. Svensson is not certain who boarded the bus, but those who did shined flashlights and carried automatic weapons and demanded documents. Svensson said he felt scared, helpless. "You're not such a big man when that happens," he said. After about 8 hours, the players and their families reached the airport in Donetsk, Ukraine, which would come under heavy fighting 2 months later. Svensson flew home to Sweden, got out of his contract with SC Tavria and signed with IFK Göteborg, his hometown club. Gustaf Svensson left, and Dixon Etu, who playing in a Swedish league in 2015. Svensson played for a team in Crimea but fled in 2014. He is now at the World Cup. Credit Marcus Eriksson, Ombrello, via Getty Images. After Russia annexed Crimea, there were calls in the international community, futile as it turned out, for Russia to be stripped as host of the 2018 World Cup. Meanwhile, Svensson said, SC Tavria was left homeless and moved its operations to Turkey to complete the tumultuous 2013-14, flying back to Ukraine to play its matches wherever it could find a stadium. The club was then dissolved, renamed TSK Tavria Simferopol, and briefly placed with 2 other Crimea-based teams in a third-tier Russian league to start the 2014-15. But Ukraine filed a complaint, considering Crimea to be its own territory held temporarily by Russia. UEFA, walking a delicate balance between sport and geopolitics, declared Crimea a special zone in December 2014, neither Ukrainian nor Russian in soccer terms. The 3 Crimean-based teams were ordered to stop playing in the Russian league. A very modest press briefing after the June 7 playoff game between Avangard Yalta and Kata Feodosia. Credit The New York Times. Ball boys amused themselves during the Yalta-Feodosia game, which Yalta won 2-1. Credit The New York Times. In 2015, Crimea received permission to start its own league, one that would show some independence by not playing the Russian anthem at matches. But Crimea was not accustomed to fielding 8 professional teams. Its officials lacked front-office management skills. There was a shortage of qualified referees. Training programs were begun and league officials said they have seen gradual improvement. Most players come from the Russian mainland, and so does a good portion of the funding, from the Russian Ministry of Sport, but the league also fields players and sponsors from Crimea, along with several Brazilians and some Ukrainians, who risk being barred from amateur and professional matches in Ukraine. "We don't have so many powerful opponents, and as a result, we are somewhat weaker and we need a few years to catch up," said Roman Kartashov, the general director of the Crimean club Kata Fedosia. Still, he added, "I believe sooner or later Crimea will get out of this position and be properly recognized, and the Crimean League will join the Russian Football Union." Attendance in the third of the Crimean Premier League varied from about 3,500 spectators at one match to 300 at others. Not all the stadiums are up to standard. One club plays on its training field. UEFA and FIFA say they continue to work with the Ukrainian and Russian soccer federations to find a common solution to the current situation in Crimea, in light of the complex state of affairs and international sanctions that are still applicable to the region. For the Feodosia-Yalta match, about 300 to 400 fans showed up. The biggest crowd this past was about 3,500 people. Credit The New York Times. On June 7, a promotion-relegation match was held between Kata Feodosia, 7th in the Crimean League, and an amateur team, Avangard Yalta, seeking to become professional. The match was held on a sunny afternoon in the port city of Feodosia, as a stiff wind blew in from the Black Sea. Entrance was free and about 300 to 400 people came to watch. The Yalta players arrived in a van 2 hours before the match. Many were working until noon today, and some were not able to come because they were not released by their employers, said Igor Kashpirko, president of the club. And yet, Yalta prevailed 2-1, seeming to gain the upper hand before playing host to the second leg of the playoff. Given UEFA's help with youth development, the possibilities seem encouraging for soccer in Crimea, Kashpirko said. "Don't worry, we will win the Champions League in 5 years' time," he said. Among other things, that would take some strenuous lobbying of the Football Federation of Ukraine. It has defiantly established a Crimean Soccer Federation and restarted a second-division club called Tavria in the Kherson region of Ukraine, just north of the Crimean Peninsula. "It's a way for the Ukrainian government to try to legitimize its hold on Crimea," said Manuel Veth, a German-Canadian journalist and lecturer who specializes in soccer in the former Soviet orbit. Svensson, the Swedish midfielder, has since hopscotched to clubs in Sweden, China and the United States and is now preparing with his teammates for a round of 16 World Cup game against Switzerland on Tuesday. His agent is still seeking money owed to him by some iteration of his former Crimean club. But Svensson is not pressing the matter. "I really don't care, to be honest," he said. "I'm happy that I got out of it in the moment, and I'm happy nothing happened, especially to my wife and her parents watching the World Cup in a war zone, where every goal matters." June 15, 2018. Finally, a loss for Russia. But only on the field. June 25, 2018. Jerry Longman is sports reporter and best-selling author. He covers a variety of international sports, primarily those of the Olympics. He previously worked at the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Dallas Times-Herald and the Clarion Ledger in Jackson, Mississippi. A version of this article appears in print on page D5 of the New York edition, with the headline, "Soccer Limbo in the World Cup's Shadow." Order reprints. Today's paper. Subscribe.